There's a set of questions about how to be honest with our kids and yet not cause undue alarm or harm when talking to them. You've touched on this a bit here and there, but maybe you could pull those thoughts together to this one question. This submitter writes, I try to be honest as possible with my kids without being alarmist. I want them to be alert and aware, but not paranoid. When they ask us why people do these things, fly planes into buildings, discriminate against people of different religions or race, or act in very violent ways, I struggle to give them a satisfactory reason. Any advice?
It's really hard. Like, I don't have a good answer for that. Like, I don't think any of us have an answer. I don't think any of us as human beings in this world have an answer for this. I think from very broad strokes, there are people who are hurting, and there are people who feel angry, and there are people who don't know what to do with those feelings. And they do things that are really, dangerous or really harmful to others. You can kind of go there and try to paint a little bit of that reality. And I definitely sort of, as much as, these are horrible and horrific things, and I'm not suggesting that we are going to justify them or validate them in any way, but I also am a firm believer that the people that do really horrific things and behaviors are doing them because they are in a very bad place. And so I don't think vilifying human beings solves a lot of problems. I think talking to kids and saying like, well, they're a bad person and that's why they do bad things, I think that just kind of polarizes people into good and bad. And it's not that simple, and we're really complicated human beings. And in general, I kind of feel like it's probably better to go to the feelings, and talk more about our kids' experience with the reality that we don't always know why people do things, and we're not going to know why people do things. And we as parents, before we even answer such a question, have to kind of sit with our own kind of ability to cope with our own uncertainty and our own lack of answers. Like, I don't have an answer to this. I don't have a fix for this. And that's really, I think, where it's helpful to go, because trying to come up with an unanswerable answer is kind of futile, and we're all going to feel a little frustrated and unsatisfied with that, including her kids. So to say, like, I don't have an answer for that, and now let's talk about what it feels like to be uncertain, to not have an answer, and how hard that is. And also to communicate in that same vein, confidence in ourselves and our children that they can handle that uncertainty. Like, this is something that this is really hard. And I know that we can do hard things like deal with uncertainty and not be able to answer every question, and not be able to know why people do things like this.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. A very difficult, particularly in this time, but a very important psychological sort of lesson is distress tolerance, and really feeling emotions and like letting it be without having to actively change them, or being able to actively change the external situation, is really, really important. We have some tips for how to cope with that, but we think it's really important that kids learn distress tolerance, right? And to tolerate uncertainty. And that's obviously a larger lesson that we're having to deal with as a society. And it's hard, and I think it's okay to validate that that's hard. And the only piece I would add to what Sarah said is, and this is potentially part of the coping, is it's really important to also think about what people can do and to activate their systems of, community and proactivity during, this question of like, why are these bad things happening? It's also really good to seek, ways that you can be involved in making things better, or the things you can do. Some of the things that Sarah and I talk a lot about in terms of that are, increasing, talking about mental health, right? Increases empathy, that for mental health, right? And talking about emotions and affects really allows people to say like, look, feelings aren't dangerous. It's how we handle them that's really important. And so I think that part of what we, want to sort of put out there is like, we have part of our proactive sort of break, to loop it back to that, is we have to really talk about these things in order to have open dialogue and community awareness so that we can feel more empowered to tolerate the things that are a little bit difficult during times.
How do we teach our kids to be aware and proactive if they hear or see the potential for violence without making them paranoid or anxious? So here it's a little bit more about how do we talk with them that empowers them to do something, like the point you were just getting at a little bit, Emily. And more specifically, this person is suggesting that they're having a hard time finding the right language to do that for a kindergartner, which, I can understand why, but again, maybe expanding on the ages, how we empower that agency at different ages for kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's helpful to think about how our emergency system in our brain works for this question. I think everybody probably has a little bit of exposure to the fight, flight, freeze system that happens when you feel a lot of anxiety or panic. And one of the things that I think is really a reframe on how we think about these, like, I even cringed. I'm like, oh, my kid is doing an active shooter drill. Like, this is, she's hiding in a cupboard as a bear, this is really hard. But I think one of the things that I like to think of from a brain perspective is, okay, look, we're practicing these drills so that they can practice the safety procedures, right? But they're also reducing anxiety in a real emergency because they've seen this scenario before. And when we act in fight, flight, or freeze, it's not always it's never engaging our prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking center, which can help us think rationally and soothe us and be, actually keep us safe in some ways, right? From a higher order thinking. So practicing these drills, and I think part of that question was like, how do you explain what will happen with an intruder, is if we do talk about it, it gives them an exposure and it sort of reduces the anxiety that might happen in a real emergency so they can act more efficiently, actually, and more safely, to be honest. So I think that I know it's a roundabout way of sort of answering your question, but I think when we think about brain science, it really helps us to say, it really validates practicing some of these things and confronting them. It doesn't make it necessarily more scary, but it does give us practice. Anything we do has practice. And so I think the more regulated we are when we present those to our kindergartner, like, how you hide it makes you really safe, and the next time that happens, you're going to be really good at being really safe. I know you're going to be able to do it because you've done it before, and that actually helps them be more reassured that they have competency in that. I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything to add for that.
No, I love that. And I think I'm thinking too, like, just looking at the question about how do we help them feel like they can be aware and proactive. Again, like for different age groups, proactivity is going to look really different. Like for a little kid, so I think it's like, okay, what's the ratio of control in a situation? For really young kids, it's very little on them and it's very much on us. And that ratio gets more evened out as they get closer to adolescence, right? So for really little kids, our job is to tell them that they just need to look to the grownups, right? The grownups have this. The grown-up's job is to keep you safe. And so you don't really have to do anything except just listen to what the grownups are telling you to do. And you can do this, right? We're really going to instill confidence in their ability to do this. Remind them that they know how to do this because they practice this and they practice it so that they can be safe. But the onus on them to really do anything is kind of non-existent, other than just listen to your grownups. And then as they get a little bit older, that's going to shift, obviously. So we want them, like, little kids don't need we want them to feel agency, but very little thing, like very tiny things make them have agency, feel like they have agency. Bigger kids need more stuff to feel like they're in control of, to have that sense of agency. And so that's, I think, kind of maybe like a framework to go with. Like, the older your child is, the more you want to reassure them that they have skills to keep themselves safe. And of course, yes, knowing and trusting that the grownups in their lives are doing everything they can to keep them safe, but also like, you know what you can do. You can, you can report something that doesn't feel safe to you.
Follow it. I think circling back to like following the protocols, right? Like really knowing the grown up to go to at school if you see something that's wrong, or if you see a child upset, right? Or if you see somebody being bullied, or if you see something scary, right? So that there's very clear sort of delineation of what you can do, and the kids really know what they can do in those situations is really self-soothing to them, right? Like, I know I can talk to this grown-up. And one of the things I think we haven't gotten to yet is what we can direct at children, but we can talk about that next. But I think identifying, people at school that they know who to speak to, if they have a feeling, or they're feeling worried, or they need to cross. Because again, we want to evoke this stop and think, is this an emergency? Let me put this into perspective, for all things, right? For emotions, for actions, so we really want to be able to get that to be like muscle memory for them, that they do it second nature, as opposed to like, more and more second nature, right? Just as us, on Friday, we were a little panicked, but then we got a little muscle memory on how to talk to kids about it. And it became easier, right, over the next few days.
Thank you. Yes, and Leah mentions in the chat, the schools use the term trusted adults with the secondary kids starting in middle school. So, having the conversations, asking them, who are your trusted adults, and do they know who they would go to, is a very much an older kid conversation to have.